Tiffany Boer is based in Melbourne, Australia, and is a 30-year-old mum of 18 hermit crabs, 11 males and 7 females. Tiffany is extremely passionate about hermit crab enrichment, taking a special interest in their nutritional needs and captive breeding. Her online shop, The Happy Hermie, is a one-stop hermit crab shop specializing in enrichment, handmade foods, and shells, and is currently pending approval as an LHCOS approved seller. Always looking to offer advice, guidance, and help within the hermit crab community, Tiffany is currently in the process of writing a manuscript for a book on the complete care of the Australian hermit crab. Her journey with hermit crabs started as a child, back when there was little information on the proper care. Fast forward to her 20s, and Tiffany was keen to try again, learning everything she could on the proper needs of hermit crabs. She has been successful in her first attempt at captive breeding C. variabilis in December of 2022, getting 3 babies to land. She is now the 3rd person in Australia to have successfully bred C. variabilis in captivity, a huge achievement. Tiffany spends her spare time educating new owners on proper hermit crab care, thereby enriching the lives of hermits all over Australia. Please welcome Tiffany Boer.
Hi everyone, welcome to CrabCon. My name's Tiffany and I'm here today to talk to you about the captive breeding of the C. variabilis, otherwise known as the Australian hermit crab. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia, and I am the owner of the Happy Hermie. Last year in December 2022, I was successful in breeding C. variabilis and getting those to land. For that process, all I used was the simple jar method, which I'm going to show you guys how I used. And I literally used a simple coffee jar. And that is how I successfully got my crabs to land. I will show you the setup in the next few photos. So as you saw in the previous picture, that was the temporary setup for my coffee jar creasel tank. The way I set it up was I used a 20-litre spare fish tank that I had sitting around. I used 2 coffee jars and 2 bubblers, an aquarium water heater, an aquarium thermometer, and I had to prop my jars up on mugs because they were too short and the water heater rod was a little bit too large as well. So I filled the tank with just water from the tap. I didn't use any conditioner in that because the Zoe would not be going into that water. Inside the jars, I used salted treated water. We use Prime over here. I kept the temperature at 28 degrees. So in Fahrenheit, that would be 82 degrees. And by putting the bubblers in the salted water and off to the side at the bottom of the jars, that created that whirlpool effect that had that natural ocean vibe, which helps the Zoe to be constantly moving. So during my time of breeding, I had 3 girls and 8 boys in my 6-foot tank back here. I only had 3 little pools in the tank at the time, 1 salt and 1 fresh. I was not expecting them to be breeding. It was quite a shock for me. I was not prepared for it and I wasn't planning on doing any breeding. So when I found Zoe in my pools at 10:30 at night on the 22nd of December last year, I was quite shocked. I didn't have a creasel set up, so I actually had to make a makeshift creasel with what I had on hand. So that's when I went with the jar method. which Sue Brown has also used and been successful in. And she is also another breeder here in Australia. So she talked me through getting all that set up. Unfortunately, I did have to leave it overnight because the temperature was not up to scratch. It hadn't hit 28 degrees, so I did need to leave my Zoe in the main tank pool overnight. I will show you guys a video of when I very first found my Zoe in our salt pool. So as you can see in the previous video, once the Zoe have spawned into the saltwater pool, they actually look like tiny little tadpoles that are whitish to translucent in color. There was quite a lot of them in the pool. As I said, I had to leave them in there overnight. The next morning, the creasel tank was all ready and set up. So I took out my salt pool out of the main tank and I used a small pipette or a dropper to suck each of the little Zoe up and put them into the creasel. I also counted each Zoe at this time, which was a long task. But we wanted to know how many that we had started with. So we did end up losing quite a few because they were kept in the main pool overnight and there wasn't very much room, only being a small 3 liters with rocks and the other adult crabs still going in and out. So we ended up with 355 Zoes on our very first count. So after placing them into our main creasel tank, we started the next day with 3 times water changes a day. So we were changing water, 2/3 of the water 3 times a day, basically using the jar. We had the water filled up to roughly here. We were changing 2/3, leaving this filled with the salt water that they were already in, and then filling it back up with fresh salt water. So this was keeping their water clean at all times. We were constantly checking the levels of the ammonia and the nitrates and the nitrites, as well as the pH level. I'll share some photos of what those little tests look like and how we did the readings. The ammonia needs to be at 0, as does the nitrates and nitrites. The pH should be sitting around to 7 to 8. So I'll show you that in our next picture. So as you can see in the previous photos, my ammonia levels were sitting at 0 and my nitrates and nitrites were also sitting at 0. My pH level was slightly low. It should have been reading about 7 to 8. At this time, I decided to start adding some calcium into the 2 creasel jars. In jar number 1, I added crushed cuttlefish bone, and jar number 2, I decided to add some crushed starfish. After a while of letting them sit in the creasel jars and then taking another pH test, I realized that the cuttlefish bone was working a lot better. The starfish didn't really make much of a difference. So we were continuing with our 3 water changes a day as the water was getting very cloudy with the cuttlefish bone. And we were starting to notice some sheds now. So the Zoe had moved from stage 1 to stage 2. We were still losing Zoe at this time, which is to be expected. They're not all going to survive. So we simply removed the dead ones from the tank, cleaned up the water, and then replaced it with fresh salted primed water. To safely remove the water without damaging any Zoe or sucking any Zoe up, I used a simple aquarium vacuum. So one end you use for the water to come out, the other end goes into the jar, and then it creates a vacuum and sucks up the water. To create a safe hose vacuum for the Zoe so that they weren't getting sucked up, I put an old stocking over the end here and I put an elastic band around it so that it was sucking up the water and the debris. There was no sucking up of any Zoe. If I did accidentally suck up any Zoe, I made sure that the water was going into a clear container. So if I did find any, I could pipette them straight back into the creasel tanks. So around day 5 is usually when we start to expect mega. Our sea variabilis crabs, they have quite a short spawning to land period. So they will spawn and usually be on land within 3 weeks. So it is quite short compared to other crab species. Day 5 is usually when they start to turn mega. We did not have them at mega stage on day 5. But I did decide to turn the bubblers from high down to low, and I did add some tiny little shells into the bottom of each jar just in case they did turn mega overnight, and it will give them a chance to start looking through the shells to take their very first shell. I'm going to share a photo of what the shells look like. I simply picked them out of shell grit, which is something you can pick up from most pet shops. It's often fed to chickens. So I went through the shell grit and picked out really small shells, made sure that there was no holes in the bottom of the shells and that the openings had been cleaned so that the mega could easily get into their very first shell. So on the morning of day 6, when we woke up, we checked our creasel tank and we finally had some megas. There was roughly around 100. You can usually tell when they've moved from zoe stage to mega stage because they have tiny little legs at the front of their body, which were not there before. So now that they were at mega stage, I had the bubblers turned down to low. I had the tiny shells in the creasel jars. And once they do become megas, they become very cannibalistic. They want to eat all the time. So we did have to start feeding them because they will end up eating each other. Despite feeding them, they still do eat each other, but we found that by feeding them, we were losing less to them eating each other. So that's when I started to add some crushed beta fish pellets. So it's just the beta pellets that you'd get from the fish shop for beta fish. I crushed those up into a powder and I would just sprinkle that into the creasel jars so that they would start munching on that instead of each other. So we moved all of our megas into jar number 2 and I left our zoe stage 2 in jar number 1 just so that the megas would not be eating the zoe and the zoe had a chance to move towards the mega stage. So by now, I was still doing our 3 water changes a day. I was adding extra prime into our water to prevent any ammonia spikes. And I also decided to start offering my megas something different to eat apart from the beta pellets. So I was adding in bloodworms, just the ones that came frozen from the pet shop that I defrosted, and I would put a few into the jar. They would sink to the bottom, and I would notice the mega munching on those. I also decided to add some strawberry pieces and also some apple slices. They would float on the top, and I would actually notice the mega would be munching on those. So I'm going to share some pictures of what the megas looked like in the next video and photos, and also pictures of the strawberries I actually put in their jar. So now we are on day 9 and we have all megas. We do not have any Zoe stage 2 left. They had either passed away or had transitioned into the mega stage. So when I did come across any passed away Zoe or megas, I made sure to remove those from the tank as they just start to dirty up the water and add a lot of ammonia into the water. So still doing our 3 times water changes a day, still adding prime at every water change, adding cuttlefish bone at every water change, as well as constantly feeding them so they don't eat each other. By day 9, we actually noticed our first megas starting to take shells. So we had our very first one in a shell. And I'm going to show you in a video of a bunch of our megas who were checking out the shells at the bottom of our tank. So by day 10, we had quite a lot of megas in their shells, which was really exciting. This was when I decided that it was time to start building the transition tank or the nursery, which is the tank that they will go into to make their way towards land, where they will go down for their first molt and graduate as land hermit crabs. So I used a small 20-litre tank. I actually went out and brought another one because my spare one I was using for the creasel tank. So I just brought a plain glass aquarium tank with a glass lid. Into this, I added 2 inches of substrate. So over here, we use 8 parts sand to 1 part of the core peat. So I only made it 2 inches because they are very little crabs. They don't need deep sand. Besides, the 2 inches is quite deep for them anyway. In this tank, I also added a large salt pool. I think the salt pool was around 1 litre. And I used a piece of cholla wood in the salt pool that they could use that to climb up out of the pool and get onto the land. I didn't add any fresh water at this time because they only needed to make it to land. Once they made it to land, that's when we would alter the transition tank and start adding in the other things that they needed. So, unfortunately, between day 10 and day 11 overnight, we actually lost power to the house, which obviously turned our creasel off and our bubblers were not working. When we woke up the next morning, we unfortunately had a huge loss of our megas. So that was quite disappointing, but these are things that we can't always control. So we had to just go with the flow with that one. We did end up with just 26 megas left after that big overnight loss. And fortunately, 13 of those were in shells. So that was quite exciting. It was at this time that I started to notice 1 or 2 of the shelled megas were starting to climb up the bubblers. This was a pretty clear sign that they were ready to try and make their way to land. So this is when I decided to start adding those into our transition tank. I simply placed them in the salt pool in the transition tank and added food into that pool as well, which was the crushed beta pellets and some strawberry and apple. And then they would be able to climb up the cholla wood to head out onto land. So in the next video and photo, I'm going to show you some of our shelled megas during a water change. You can see them crawling around in the shells at the bottom, and one of them is actually carrying their very first shell. And in the photo, you can also see that one of the shelled megas is climbing the bubbler, which is a pretty clear sign they are ready to head to land. So now that we had 2 megas in our transition tank, in shells and in the salt pool, I was making sure to keep the tank at 30 degrees Celsius. Usually over here, our crabs like it at about 28, but in the transition tank, we decided to have it a little bit hotter. And the humidity was sitting around 90%. So that's just to help them transition over to land and obviously using their modified gills. So now we are exactly 2 weeks into our journey since our Zoe first spawned in our saltwater pool. We have 5 megas in shells that are confidently carrying their shells around, eating, acting very normal. We had quite a few more that were in shells, but unfortunately, we were noticing that they were just dropping their shells and not going back in. So that was a little bit disappointing, but you can't really force a crab or a mega to take a shell. It's entirely up to them. So the 5 that were confidently in their shells and were starting to climb the bubblers, I moved all 5 of those into our transition tank. We started with 2 in the transition tank, and then I moved over the other 3. So we now had 5. I decided to keep the creasel going just to see if we had any more megas that were going to go into shells. I didn't want to give up on them just yet, but I was also still concentrating on the transition tank. By now, our very first shelled mega had actually made its way onto the cholla wood, which was very exciting. It had actually moved out of the salt water and was sitting in the air on the cholla wood. And I'm going to show you guys some pictures of that in the next frame. So we are on day 15 now, and unfortunately, overnight, we had 2 of our shelled megas in the transition pool come out of their shells. Unfortunately, they did not go back in and they did end up passing away. This was quite disappointing, but the really good news was that we had our very first shelled mega to land. So that was very exciting. I'm going to show a photo of what it looked like when the shelled mega got onto land. So by now, our first shelled mega is to land, and our last two shelled megas were on the Chollywood heading towards land as well. It was at this time I noticed that the first one started to dig down. This was an obvious sign that it was going down for its very first molt. Although they are to land, they are not actually successful land hermit crabs just yet. They do need to go down and have their very first molt. When they come back up, they will have graduated to land hermit crabs. This only lasted one night. They are quite small, so their molting process is very, very fast. The next morning, I noticed that the first shell mega had come back up from its molt, and I was over the moon that we had successfully gotten a Zoe all the way to a successful land hermit crab. You could tell a difference in the appearance when they were in their shells as megas. They were still quite translucent, sort of a whitish color. The first one that went down and came back up, it had changed into more of a colored tone. I would say a really, really pale brown. They were no longer see through and they were busy exploring the tank, which was really exciting. I'm going to show you a photo and a video of what our first successful captive bred land hermit crab looked like. So, as you can see in the picture and the video previously, the color and the appearance has changed slightly. The crab does look slightly darker now. Not as dark, obviously, as the adults, but definitely not as transparent anymore. And you can clearly see their little black eyes. So that was really exciting. Day 17, we had our last two shelled megas officially come to land. By now, I had decided to change up the transition tank a little bit. I removed the large 1 liter saltwater pool and I added two smaller pools. So they were about 100 mil to 250 mil each. I did a salt one and a fresh one. I added a bubbler into the salt one to mimic the ocean again. I just used some craft mesh in those so that the baby hermit crabs were easily able to get in and out for drinking and bathing. I also added some of my own homemade leaf litter and just some climbing wood, some plants, things to hide behind. I also added a little shell shop with some shells that was slightly bigger, as baby hermit crabs do grow quite quickly. So I wanted to have the right shell sizes available for them. With their food bowl and their shell shop, they need to be as shallow and as flat as possible because they are so small. They can't actually get onto or into anything that is too high up. So I used open scallop shells and I filled those with some shells and some of the foods that they had previously been having while they were in the creasel tank. I added some mashed up banana, some mashed up apple and strawberries, bloodworms, spirulina, green sand, worm castings, beetroot powder, and some crushed cuttlefish bone. Basically, just to try and encourage them to eat and to start to gain up that strength. I did notice slowly that they were sort of starting to eat, and by now the other two hermit crabs had gone down. They had come back up from molting. They were officially hermit crabs. So that was really exciting. We started with 355 Zoe in total, and we ended with 3 official land hermit crabs. So that was a huge achievement. I really didn't think that we would get there, especially on my first try of breeding. So that was a huge achievement in itself and something that was really something I was very proud of. So I'm going to show you a picture of what my transition tank looked like in total after the megas had officially graduated to land hermit crabs. So I had now had my 3 baby hermit crabs in the transition tank for a week. I thought they were going really well, but at the same time, they are really, really sensitive and quite delicate. So it's really touch and go the entire time. Even the slightest changes in temperature or humidity can really affect their health and cause them to pass away. Unfortunately, I found one of the baby hermit crabs had come out of its shell. I did follow the naked crab protocol. I didn't want to pick the baby up because I didn't want to damage it. So I simply put a bottle cap over the top of the crab to isolate them. And I added a few extra little shells, which were the same size that it was already in, as well as its original shell. I gave it a few days. Unfortunately, it didn't take its shell back and it did end up drying out and passing away. It was quite disappointing because of all the hard work I put in, but like I said, they are very sensitive. Another few days goes by. I am noticing them eating. I am noticed another one has gone down, probably for their second molt. I was quite excited, but at the same time, you don't really know what's happening under the sand. That one didn't actually come back up. I waited weeks with the transition tank on, and I never saw that little crab again. By now, I had one little crab left. They had been in the transition tank for almost 3 weeks. And then I noticed one of them was naked in the freshwater pool. Unfortunately, they also didn't make it. So I was left with no baby hermit crabs. It was very heartbreaking at the start because I put a lot of effort and time into this. And I was quite hopeful as it did work out to begin with. But unfortunately, we can only control so much in their transition tank and in their life. Hermit crabs lay a lot of eggs and they have a lot of zoe spawn because the likelihood of all of them surviving is pretty much slim to none. So, usually in the wild, only a few of them will actually survive. So, to even have 3 of them come out and be land hermit crabs in captivity was quite impressive, but it was quite disappointing when they did pass away. I did hold on to the transition tank for quite a few weeks in the hope that maybe the one had gone down would come back up. But when I eventually decided to turn the tank off and clear out all the sand, I did find its empty shell and no sign of its body, unfortunately. I am going to share some photos of what they looked like when they were in the tank and they were living as land hermit crabs. It was a really exciting time and they were just beautiful little babies. So I really hope that this video taught you something and that it encourages you to give hermit crab captive breeding a go. It's certainly not easy and it is very time consuming, but I do believe it's quite rewarding in the long sense. And if we can keep wild hermit crabs wild, that just simply reduces the amount of animal abuse in the hermit crab pet industry. So I really do think it's quite an important thing to be trying to achieve. The lessons that I have learned is that it is certainly not impossible to captive breed hermit crabs. And you need to celebrate the small successes, whether it's just getting Zoe, even if they don't survive, because it means that your crabs are happy and healthy and they are mating. Whether you are getting them into shells, to mega stage, or even to land, they are all tiny successes. And these are all things that we are still learning. Every day we learn something new about these little crabs and about the breeding process. So if you can be a part of that, that's just a really wonderful start. And if you have already started, you're already a step ahead of everybody who has never tried to give it a go. My advice would definitely be to find yourself a mentor, someone who has done this before, whether they have been successful or have gotten most of the way. Finding a mentor and asking them a million questions is really helpful. I confided in Sue Brown here in Australia, and she was more than helpful. I never would have gotten my crabs to land if it wasn't for all of her advice and all of her help. So I'm truly appreciative of that. Some of the myths that we often hear, whether it's on Facebook, in Facebook groups, or on Google, is it is impossible to breed hermit crabs in captivity and that you need a science lab set up. I think that most of us who have been successful have proved that wrong. Myself and Sue used the coffee jar method and we were both successful. So it's pretty simple to set up a creasel, whether you have a proper creasel going or you just use the coffee jar method. It's certainly not impossible, and that is definitely a myth. Just because it didn't work the first time doesn't mean that you should give up. I definitely recommend going again. I will be breeding again this coming summer, and over winter, I will be building a proper creasel tank. So I'm very excited about that. I also highly recommend joining Hermit House. So they are a non-profit organization based in the US, working to keep wild crabs wild by supporting potential breeders and successful breeders in their breeding journey. So I highly recommend joining them. It's an absolutely great program run by some terrific breeders. I've also noticed that during my entire video, which was filmed over 2 days, that Maverick just here has been on the wheel the entire time. So he wanted to be in my video. Thanks so much for watching, guys. And I really hope you enjoy CrabCon and that you learned something new today.